I realised how much I've caught the sun today. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Phil Knott. I have many hats on in terms of my roles. Some people know me from the West Highland College up here in Skye and Lochalsh. I'm a crofter as well, and for those who don't know, a croft is kind of a small holding, a small farm in this region. And so I've got a little bit of land, quite difficult, challenging land, the crofts up here. So I've been growing trees successfully for quite a long period of time. And everywhere I've been, everywhere I've lived, I've grown trees and enjoyed that, right from growing from southwest England, heavily involved in a lot of the work down, particularly on Dartmoor. There's a fantastic project called More Trees there. I really enjoyed that and worked with the Tree Council and lots of organisations to get more trees going. So I've kind of got experience across the board. Since moving to Skye about 5 years ago and having our croft here, I've wanted to just kind of take my skills further, and it's like one of my main hobbies now is just growing trees and like showing them around as well. It's quite a nice kind of gift to pass on to people. So I'll show you what I've got today. It'll be a summary guide of pretty much all the species, but with the caveat that it's going to be for the northwest of Scotland. Now, the trees, the oaks, the ashes, the rounds, they're right across the board in the UK. They're very much a northwestern flavour. So apologies if there's any omissions in there that you're hoping to see. You can always ask questions and I can direct to you afterwards. I'll try and get my screen shared now. Okay, I'll just get back to the start up here. And as Karen said, I've got a bit of a tickly throat today. I don't know what from. I think it's from being in the polytunnel, just in and around the flowers or something in there, but something's just kind of caught my throat. So I do apologise if I just have to duck away for a minute or have a coughing fit. Just trying to get the barrier down. Here we go. Sorry, the bar was in the way for my slideshow option. Things just take a little bit of time on Zoom, even though it's a very small presentation. Okay. Karen, is that all good? Are you seeing the start of the PowerPoint? Grand, super. We'll see how we do with time today. I'm covering quite a lot, and I do want to leave time for questions as well. And Karen can just cut in at any point with kind of pertinent questions to the point, because I'll be covering different parts. I'll give you a contents guide as to how I'm going to lay out the talk, so we can try and break it down a little bit into questions for that. Okay, so why grow your own trees? That's kind of the first question. You know, they're readily available to buy in lots of places. It's kind of a commercial enterprises, and they're relatively cheap in most cases if you're buying numbers of them. But for the main reason I found it has just been the enjoyment of growing your own trees. You get a lot of pleasure, not just collecting the seed, being out collecting the seed, being out in nature collecting the seed, bringing it back, preparing it, and then not knowing whether it's going to germinate. And if it does, in some cases it's all your seeds germinate, some cases just a handful. And then you get to follow the whole process through, and then either gift it on or plant it out. And so it's the whole process, not just bring it through. So I get real pleasure out of that. And cost-wise, trees can be cheap, but at the same time, if you're buying just like 100 or 150, it can actually be quite expensive to kind of get them in, because wholesalers tend to deal with the thousands, and then you can get them for a bit cheaper. But growing them yourself, you can do it for essentially zero cost. I'll show you there's different things you can spend your money on, but very much cheap. Excellent learning experience to learn more about the trees and learn and get applicable rules that apply for all sorts of plants. So it really improves your knowledge. They're not the same as garden plants or vegetables. I've learned that they're very, very different. And they're not actually, in some cases, not as tough as some of the plants. And I'll cover provenance, and the word provenance, explain what that means, but guaranteed provenance, so you know where they come from as well, because this day and age, particularly with the tree diseases and pathogens flying around, a lot of that's been from moving trees and moving seedlings and moving seeds across Europe, across the world. And if you buy birch trees, it could be that they've grown in southern England, it could be they've grown in Scotland, in some cases they're kind of grown in Eastern Europe, And so we are an era of moving plant diseases around. We should really try and be stopping that. We don't need to. However, it can take a very long time to get results with trees. I'll show you some of the time frames. It depends how long you've got. And it can be quite labour intensive at certain times. Depends on the methods that you use. So I can show you the different sides to that. So I'll cover provenance first, and then I'll cover the rules of seed and cutting collection. That's quite important. And then we'll go through cuttings, seed dormancy, I'll explain what that is, the different types of seed and their preparation, stratification is a term I'll define and show you what that means. I'll have a quick look at the different growing methods for doing it at home cheaply, so beds versus pots versus cells. Look at germination and growing on, and then I'll finish on just a handful of resources. I don't want to overwhelm you with things. So a lot to cover, and I'll try and do it concisely as I can, but also try and explain it quite well. Karen can please flag up if I'm not catching it right.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly say, because we've had a few more people join since we started. If anyone wants to ask questions, that the easiest way would be to pop it into the chat this function on there, and then I can pose the questions as we're going along that way. So just a wee bit of housekeeping. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. So provenance in relation to trees it is quite important. So basically where trees come from, it can make a big difference as to where you're growing them. So particularly here in the west coast of Scotland, we have particular levels of exposure, different levels of altitude. The geology can be different in a different area. Soils can be different. And then the phenology, the actual timing of when the trees come out and the form that they grow in, when their flowers come out, all makes a big difference. And so if you've got trees from all over the place, they don't really fit in with the local environment. They might be fine, they might thrive, they might do better, they might be a better shape. In a lot of cases, they won't. And so you try, and for planting schemes and for native trees, you want to be looking at getting seed as close as you can, or cuttings as close as you can. And there is a guide online there, as you can see, the Forestry Commission one not using that. That's more of a kind of a commercial angle, but there's lots of resources out there if you want to kind of learn more. And in there is this map here. So I've apologies just for those in Scotland up here, but it breaks it down into different zones. And so we on the Isle of Skye are on zone 104, and that's the same as Mull and Isla and a lot of the small isles. And if you're looking to do a planting scheme here, the buyers and things and suppliers will try and get from that region there. There's very few tree nurseries in this region here. And if you can't get from your region, you'll be looking to get from the next region. So for us, 103 in the Outer Hebrides, 105 Wester Ross, and so on. And so the further you get from your zone, kind of the least ideal it is for your site. But in some cases, if you can't get it, then they will just get things. And so that should be the same rules that you're applying. If you're growing from home, you want to be looking at that. Rules regarding seed and cutting collection, and mostly they're to do with commercial purposes. And you say, well, if you're just doing it at home, that's fine. But if you start selling your trees on a few pounds a pop and things, then you are getting, that is for commercial purposes, even if it's for small numbers. So if you're collecting, you should be asking permission for that. Same as if you're on nature reserves and designated sites. And if you're out and about with a pair of secateurs just kind of lopping things off, you do want written permission from the land, and please carry that with you as well, because you should be challenged for that. But then obviously Scottish Outdoor Access Code and general rules on foraging, yes, you can take a few seeds here and there. You know, I'm like a schoolboy when I get home, you tip my pockets out and there's usually seeds and bits of things everywhere that I found on my walks. But if you're going to do it in large numbers, as you may want to do, yes, I really consider, and it's good form, isn't it, as well, just to ask permission to say, I'm going to be doing this today, I'm collecting 500 acorns or so. That's fine, and say where you're getting it from. If you're doing it commercially, you're thinking of ideas of kind of selling the trees on, then there's quite a lot of hoops and rules to jump through about where you're getting it and how to source it. And I won't cover in that today. That is another kettle of fish, really. But we're just going to focus on the smaller scale. And then when you are collecting, of course, it's better to kind of collect sparingly from a range of sources. Don't go nuts in one particular tree. Just try and get across the board. spread it out. And that's good for the genetics of it as well. So seeds versus cuttings. What's the advantages of seeds and cuttings? I'm going to be focusing on both today, but I'm going to kind of urge you down the line of getting seeds, really. That's because of the genetic diversity. Seeds often kind of take two parents and it kind of marries in, and you get the better kind of genetics from the local area. Cuttings, of course, are a clone of the plant. There's advantages and disadvantages of that. You know, you can get, if it's kind of genetically pure plant, or it's a rare one out somewhere, and it's very difficult to get seed on. If it's not seeding, then that's quite a useful way. But that does lead to problems as well. So sexual dimorphism, so to kind of throw the technical terms in there, but basically trees can be boys or girls. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I don't want you coming away from this talk having grown on holly seeds for the next 4 or 5 years into trees, and then write me a letter in 4 years' time saying, "Why don't I have any berries?" That's because you might have taken a cutting from all males. You might have taken 50 male cuttings, and you'll never get any berries. So hollies, like a lot of other trees, male or female. So some trees will never have berries because they're males. And so that applies to things, aspens and things like that as well. So do bear that in mind. And the time factor as well, it can be a bit of both. Really, cuttings can be very easy, just kind of cut and then jam in the ground. Seeds, however, you can get large numbers, but there's a lot more work going on than that. So it depends on the numbers you're looking for and the species. So choosing a tree, you'll be looking, I say, something within your region if you can, but a lot of the trees in planted areas or in planted areas across your region may not have been from your region. And so if you're into a planted area of native woodland, if it hasn't grown itself naturally, then it's quite likely that's been planted from somewhere else. And if you're just propagating that on, it's growing there and it's established there and it's doing okay, but it's not as good as a true wild species that's out and about in kind of native woodlands and in more kind of remote places. And it's going to be true, of course, lots of trees have been brought into the areas up here, and a lot of the hedging plants, of course, you know, if you're taking them from hawthorns and elders, they're probably planted at some stage. It would be planted as a hedge. And if they're in and established, there's not much you can do about that. You just kind of make a call to see if it looks like it's in place and it's growing well, then that helps. A lot of trees can be hybrids as well. And so it depends on what you're looking for in terms of purity, but a lot of the things like the willows can be real mixed bags as to their true characters. A lot of the roses are the same. So it depends if you're looking for purity to then propagate yourself. But just take a good look at the tree and see how well it's growing. If it's looking healthy in the conditions, it's not struggling at all. And that would be kind of a good one to start with as well, if you thought that it's probably a native. And if you see a tree that's heavy seeding, you think that's a good sign. Not always. As you know, for gardeners and things, seeding and flowering and things can be a sign of stress, and it could be that the tree is on its way out. It could be that it's not happy growing where it is and it's just trying to reproduce before it carks it, basically. But it could be as well that, as I said at the bottom, it could be a mast year. A mast year is when a tree or plant has a particular abundant year. There's a lot of fruits have that as well, a lot of nuts, and so you can have a really good year of, say, acorns, and then the tree will have a rest for a few years and then not have so many for the next few years. Sometimes they just kind of produce large numbers every year, sometimes large numbers every 4 or 5 years. Some trees like aspen, they very rarely flower, and you can get sort of every 10 years there'll be a flowering event. And then in terms of selecting seed as well, just bear in mind that you may be selecting seed just from trees that are accessible. I'm not saying climb up gorges and get step ladders and break your neck for that one tree. This is not that important, but do consider that as well. You obviously be getting more seed from accessible ones as you go along. So I'll cover cuttings. This is quite a complicated topic in some ways because every tree is a little bit different. And for those of you who do gardening, propagation, some it may come very easily. For some who've not covered it before, maybe a bit trickier. But there's softwood and hardwood cuttings, and I'll just do a little explanation of those. So softwood you're taking, usually earlier than now on the whole, you'll be taking them just from the tips, the buds, sort of the top, say 6 inches of a shoot in spring and summer once the leaves are out. And then you want to get that plant rooting, and then you want it established and happy before it kind of loses its leaves for winter. So that's the aim of kind of getting that in. And that's, I say, from the tip and usually kind of up to pencil thumb thickness. And that's pretty big for some, so it can be just little whips. Things like birch, you can just take tiny, like pencil lead thickness. You don't think it would survive at all, you think it would die off, but they're amazing, really. A lot of the nodes within these twigs, they're already primed for root production if something goes wrong. It's amazing how quickly they can just switch it on. But with softwood cuttings, moisture is kind of the key to success. And it's recommended with a lot of these is that if you're going to jam it in a plant pot, then you want to not lose too much moisture. And that's where things go really wrong. And that's often done by even having a bag over the pot, just putting like a little plastic bag over it and putting an elastic band around it just to kind of keep it humid. You think it would just rot in there, you think it would sweat out. But no, that's the best way of doing it. It controls the climate, keeps the humidity constant, and that really helps. And if you can try and get it warm, that does help as well. So if you're lucky to have something like a conservatory or greenhouse or a polytunnel away from direct sun, if you can kind of in a shaded spot, that will help to keep it warm. Even inside, will just help to get the roots going. But it doesn't work for that. It's more better for fruit bushes and things. But those trees listed there, birch, willow, aspen, round, blackthorn, elder cherry, and bird cherry, all can take softwood cuttings to varying levels of success. You can put lots in trays with deep roots and try and get them away from there. I've not tried that many of the species. I mostly work with seeds, but I have looked at all the resources for a lot of these. And for some species, it might be preferable. Things like the cherries, they can be a devil to get the seeds from because the birds get to them and they don't have a huge number of seeds. So if you're looking to cultivate cherries, it's certainly worth having a go. And the fact is, it takes you no time at all, just a pair of secateurs working through. And as long as you can get it in a good growing substrate in some kind of pot, even if it's a yogurt pot, something nice and free. And some species will work definitely better than others. Things like willows, I mean, you could plant it upside down and then leave it outside and it will still be fine. Whereas some of the other ones can be a bit tricky. Elder is another one, it's a good one. You can just easily get that away. Things like birch, it depends, it can really vary, but just get lots and you've got a good chance. Hardwood cuttings, as you can see from the illustration there on the left, that's either autumn or winter cut. This is for different species. So you take the tip off, you don't use the growing tip for that one, and you have more of a sturdy twig, and you want to kind of jab that in to the ground or a growing substrate somewhere. And that'll be in winter, so there'll be no leaves on there, which shouldn't be. There'll be things like holly can have leaves. You can remove a few of those leaves, just try and minimize the transpiration. Difficulty with some of these is it can be rotting off, and you can think they're just kind of going to die. I would say definitely be patient with these things as well. You can put them in the ground. Nothing happens in April. Nothing happens in May. It looks all black. It looks all brown. Some of them have burst to life in March. Are absolutely fantastic, but some just are not looking good. But April, May, don't give up, and you can easily get a little bit growing from the base sometimes as well if all the buds have died. And those species you're seeing there are quite good for that. So I'm not going to stress too much on this today because I think seed is preferable. These are for clones, but it does save you time, of course, because by the end of that next year, you'll have a tree that's 6, 10, 12 inches. You've saved yourself a year or two. And if you're just doing it for a hedge, of course, then that helps. Unfortunately, I've not seen any resources on things like hawthorn, which is kind of what people really want to do for hedging and things like that. Roses, it works well out, of course. Roses, you can do all sorts of cuttings. Again, they're pretty tough. But things like hawthorn, I've not seen many resources. I'm not having success myself on cuttings, but very easy by seed. And whether you use rooting powder, that's another thing. I have used it. I don't know if it makes a huge difference, but I haven't done any kind of scientific controls. I suspect it probably does make a slight difference. And whether you wound it as well. So where you put it in the ground, if you stimulate it with a knife or you crush it, bash it around a little bit, apparently that helps to kind of stimulate root growth as well. And you can't go wrong in a lot of these things, really. But what you're looking for is more of a free draining mix. And what I mean by that is something that the water just doesn't waterlog in. It's not too kind of dominated by compost or peat or something. And so sand or perlite or vermiculite, these are kind of horticultural products you can get from all garden centres or you can get online. And it just holds the moisture at just the right level. So let's drain through, but there's always a bit of moisture there. And the term slit trench as well, that's often just in the ground, and you can make a trench, open it up, and then get a bit more sand and perlite in there, just to kind of a bit more free draining, and you can just jab your cuttings in there over winter, and they don't need to be kind of protected. They'll just they'll hopefully get some root establishment and then be ready and sprouting next spring. But numbers, just play the numbers game, because you're bound to get more. You can jam 15 or 20 in a pot as long as they've got a bit of root growing, and you're away. And then when it does come up, you've got a question, you just leave it. I've seen some resources, and I've seen some guides of just like, well, you try and take off every bud apart from the top one when it's shooting up, just to give it the best chance of just kind of getting away. I just leave it myself, but see if it works. And as I'll show you, I do a lot in fish boxes, as is the picture there with the willows on the right. And that's just great because you can get a good depth of soil in there. You can just throw loads in. Perfect for the that's willow growing there. A very low density. I could have jammed in double that. Another option as well is coppice root cuttings. And that's where you cut a tree down to the ground. And most of the hardwood species, most of the broadleafs, when you cut them down to the ground, they will coppice, they will sprout up again. And certain species, particularly like hazels and apples, but a lot of them, they'll send up multiple stools. They'll send up sort of 10 or 15 little suckers as it is. If you cover that with soil as they're coming up, those suckers often have a bit of a root on. You can then divide them off and pot it on. So it's very good for hazel in particular. If you cut a hazel down, and you're going to use that, use the poles and things like that, that's one way to do it. It doesn't work for all species, but there's no harm in trying that. And you can even just mount it up on one side of it, potentially. All you need is one little root and it's away. And as I said before, please just wait if things don't look good. Things like holly as well, their leaves often drop off and they look black. I've got some holly that are 2 years on and they're still just okay, and they're starting to come now. It just takes time for some of those type of species.
So, sorry, Phil, there was a question come in there. Do you use willow water for rooting tree cuttings? Yeah,
so I must have removed that. Actually, I didn't see it because I had a link for rooting tea, and that's exactly that. Yes, I have heard that works. So you can crush up willow stems, and that willow in itself has kind of the rooting compounds in it. So you can let it steep in there for a few days, kind of makes a kind of a green, kind of slimy tea. That's another way of dipping cuttings in. And gardeners and things as well, they often say things like molasses and honey and things like that. I've not tried that myself, but apparently that works all year. So yes, a willow tea is very easy to make yourself, and there's lots of recipes for that online. But I haven't done a control, so I don't know if you've done 50 of what they do, 50 that don't. But I'm not stressing too much on cuttings. But I've had pretty reasonable success just out in the garden.
And another question as a point of clarification, I think. Anne says, I'm used to softwood meaning conifers and hardwood meaning deciduous trees. You refer to softwood in a different way. So can you maybe...
Just lost
yeah, sorry. I think your previous slide sort of looked like it explained that. I don't know if you want. I don't know.
Yes, so softwood, you're right. You're spot on. Softwoods and hardwoods, you often do that in terms of firewood and things like that, and you kind of cover it. So softwoods would be mostly conifers. Hardwoods would be all the broadleafs, deciduous trees. But in the case of the cuttings, no, that's the opposite. So this can't be done with conifers that I'm aware of, and there's a few Japanese techniques out there for propagating some conifers. But on the whole, no, you can't take easily. You can't take cuttings from conifers. So everything I covered there was on native broadleaf shrubs and trees.
So the softwood refers to the new growth rather than...
Yeah, so this year's growth as opposed to... it could still be this year's growth on a hardwood cutting, but not the softer tip, so it's grown on a little bit.
Yeah, you can generally kind of see them on trees, can't you? They're a bit greener and I guess softer. Yeah. I hope that helps, Anne. If you need a bit more clarification on that, just ask and we can come back to it.
No, good point, thank you. And so I'm just going to look at the propagation here by cuttings. This is obviously willow. You may have seen it for things like basket willow and things like this. This is a slightly bigger osier willow, which is more of a living hedge willow. But we propagate this on the Croft. okay, we don't like using plastic too much, but it does work very well for this species, just jammed cutting through. And then each year that grows up to about 8 feet with about 4 or 5 stems on each of those. And then you can then use those for cuttings again next year and just propagate it on. So we're using that for screening and things. That works quite well. For some more exposed areas, it doesn't really work so well. It gets kind of a bit wind scorched and battered around and snaps quite readily. But those kind of willow you can just do with all things. You can do that with other species as well. Just jam through plastic, but willow in particular just takes. I just focus a little on aspen root cuttings because I'm a big fan of aspen trees. This is say root cuttings, not branch or stem cuttings. So aspen, I say they don't seed readily. Certainly in Scotland, mostly in the UK, they don't seed readily. It's only in certain conditions. They're very well spread out. They're the most palatable of trees, and so there's very few of them left out in the wild. And so people kind of think of them as ones that grow on cliffs or in remote places. That's just because that's where they haven't been grazed or removed from. So they're a very rare tree. You want to help propagate those. They grow well in wet ground. They grow well in dry ground. They're a cracker of a tree. And most of the aspens we have, if you find one, you're often going to find a dozen or more. And that's because they're a clone. They send up suckers of their own, and they are all one living plant. It look like all these separate trees, different shapes, different sizes, but you'll find that they all come into leaf together. They fall out of leaf, and they'll all be one clone, either boy or a girl. And that can take over a vast area. And you might have seen some of the famous ones in Canada, which just take over square miles of some of the oldest and biggest organisms on Earth. But the best way of propagating those is not by seed or by cutting. They will go by cuttings. You can do ordinary cuttings, but root cuttings. And so again, you definitely need permission for that if you're going to be taking roots. And you'll be looking for kind of like cables that basically lay under about 2 or 3 inches under the ground from the tree. And they're kind of often yellowy orange color, and usually about thumb thickness. You'll find them, and they're very easy just to divide with a spade. You can bring up a little length, and what I do is just put a length of those in a fish box. I say fish box for everything. You'll see what I mean if you don't understand the term. Very much a West Coast thing for us. Bury them in compost. Bury the roots in compost as it is, quite rich compost. And next spring, April, May, June, they'll send up cuttings that just shoots straight through. The more commercial operations will be taking those cuttings off as they come. They'll be lifting the root, severing them off, and then treating those like a softwood cutting, and then trying to root them on, often in water or potted on, and with kind of humidity controlled. But I just leave it. I just see how many come up, and it's a bit stronger. And then at the end of that year, and it will be that year because aspen grow very fast, you can then go in, take a spade or secateurs to the root, and you can have 5 or 6 different trees from one bit of root. And you can leave a bit of root in there for next year, and it just keeps going on. And so you can have a non-stop supply of aspen if you want. But it will always be the same plant that's coming up. So you may want to mix it up now and again. Lots of more resources, particularly with Trees for Life and the Enterprises. They do a lot of great work with aspen. And they're really trying to help get aspen back on the map in Scotland. But I thought I'd give it a shout out as a bit of a special case. I've gone to seeds.
Can I just, sorry, before we move on to seeds, there has been another question just coming up about cuttings. Juniper cuttings. Is it something you've ever tried?
I've not tried it. I'm trying to think if I've worked some of the tree nurseries, and I can't think if they took success. Around Trees for Life have certainly looked at juniper cuttings. I suspect they probably would. Juniper is quite a difficult plant to grow, actually, from seed and from. I haven't seen it myself, so I can't say. But if there is, there'll be papers out there on it. So I don't know, but probably I would think.
That's grand. And I'll just quickly say before I mute myself again, Debbie will maybe come back to your question at the end, because it's a bit more general. Andy's saying about the junipers, the seeds take years to germinate, so that's probably why it's so difficult. But yeah, that's grand. Thank you. We'll come back to some of the other questions that are popping up just now as well.
Okay. So now cover seeds. So I'm going to cover the different types of dormancy first, then I'll cover the different types of seed as they come. And it's quite important to understand the dormancy of the seed and the categories they fall into. So that if you're gathering them, you know the time frames involved. which can be quite long. So basically in 3 categories. So deep dormancy, seeds that will be dormant for typically 2 or more winters. So you can collect the seed in whatever format it may be, say from a berry or from a winged seed, and you then have to keep that and know where that is for the next couple of years, at least a couple of winters, and it should germinate in the next spring. But it could be more, it could be 3, it could be 4. I've got seeds coming up from old, it's kind of 5 years ago. They just keep coming up. So they is whenever conditions are just right for them. Shallow dormancy, which is most species on the whole, is just 1 winter. So you can say collect it in the autumn, and then it will be germinating in the spring. So shallow dormancy. And then live seed, I'll cover all of these in more detail. Live seed is something that is coming off the tree live, ready to go into the ground, and will die very quickly without being in the ground when in moisture. You can potentially store those, but on the whole, you need to kind of be in kind of labs and things to kind of do it properly. And why is that? Why is the strategy for this? Why would trees do this? Obviously, the main thing for dormancy is that if you have a very warm autumn or the right conditions, then a seed can come down very quickly, can be eaten by a bird or something, and then it could immediately start germinating because the conditions are warm and it's bright, and that would then die. It wouldn't be able to put on enough growth for winter and would likely die. So you're looking for a strategy that will see you through and then give you a full growing season the next year. So come up at just about the right time. And that varies from February through to May in most cases. Some can be very late. And it could be other strategies as well, of course, in terms of dispersal and ground conditions and things like that. It can just buy you a bit of opportunity if you can be 2 or 3 years staggered. So that year's crop, if you have a particularly good year of seed, if they're spread out over quite a wide area, particularly assisted by birds and animals, then they have more chances if they're staggered germination after that. So it's a good strategy, and it's obviously worked because these trees continue it, and that's what's in their genes now. So it's worked very well for them. So the deep dormant species that we'll be covering, well, just kind of, they're all kind of lumped in together here, and then I'll look at the different categories of seed and the preparation after that. So I'm not going to go into individual prescriptions for these species because there's kind of common rules that we can look at afterwards. So roses, ash. Now people might be kind of flagging up about ash at the moment because of ash dieback and things. But what they wanted to stop is foreign imports and things at the moment. So there has been rules, changing the rules. So you can be growing your own ash, but they're not looking for you to be moving it around in large quantities. But if you're growing from a healthy tree and growing on, that is acceptable at the moment. So that's the little link there if you want to look at it further. There's a lot of that was kind of just before COVID, I think. A lot of those rules came out, so a lot missed by a lot of folk. Yew, juniper, holly, hawthorn, elder. So a lot of the kind of the hedgerow species and things as well, they can take quite a long time. There's a rose hip there on the right, but look at the advantage of that is that one rose hip, as you'll see, can be 20 or 30 seeds in there, whereas something like a hawthorn is just one. So there's a lot of work for those. And shallow dormant, would say the rest of them really on the whole. So there'll be a lot of tree species I haven't included in there, but a real mixture. So not just nuts, but winged seeds and berries right across the board there. So these you should collect in the autumn and they'll be growing for the next year. So things like oak I've kind of covered there. It says below ground, they will start germinating almost straight away in some cases. Now put taproot down. So that's not necessarily completely dormant, but they won't be above ground until next spring. Gelder rose will only work below ground the next year. So it will germinate, but it'll be working below ground and it'll be 2 years before it comes up above the ground. So that's an unusual rule, that one there. And for those up in the northwest of Scotland as well, I said about kind of native trees, I put sycamore in there because sycamore grows very well for us up here and is easy to germinate. And a lot of folk are looking at what they can do for shelter. It's not a pest species up here. A lot of you be kind of shaking your heads, certainly for down south. It can get out of hand in woodlands. Up here, we haven't found that yet. Maybe with climate change it might be. I don't want to be held responsible for the wave of sycamore across the region. So just please bear that in mind, that it could potentially become a pest species up here. But maybe as a sacrificial species if you're using it for shelter. And then live seed. So this applies to willows, aspen and elm. I say aspen is very rare to seed. Willow, readily seeds en masse. It has better years, depends if the flowers get pollinated, and that's quite an early flower, the willow, and so if it's a particularly wet spring, it's very bad. Last 2 springs for us have been very dry and perfect, so there's been lots and lots of willow seeds. I'll show you pictures of willow seed in just a second so you know what you're looking at. And an elm as well, and that's a live seed that needs to kind of go in the ground, pretty sharpish. So these are early on in the summer, May or June typically. And with elm, you just kind of wait for them just to be turning ready. So they're green kind of little keys. I'll put a picture on the next slide. And just as they're starting to turn brown, that can be into June as well. Usually it's May, and depends where you are in the country, depends on the local conditions, the spring it is. But with those, I'll start looking at the kind of prescriptions of them now. With all of those species, just get them into compost and just even put tiny covering on it, but even just wetting them is usually enough to keep them on the surface. And with so many things about growing trees as well, it's getting it wet, but not too wet. You just want the soil damp. They all send the root down pretty quick. They're used to kind of growing in these conditions. But of course, if you're growing it in a pot outside, then that can dry out very quickly. So you want to try and keep it shaded, just keep it damp, but not soaking it all the time. They don't need that much. They just need dampness. And of course, they do need to send a root down to kind of secure that. And if you just keep watering them all the time, they might rot for a start. But also they might not be able to send the roots down properly because they've got all the water they need at the surface. And then when it does go dry, they just can die off. So those are the live seeds. And this is what it looks like. This is willow fluff on the left, the kind of candy floss. And there's little black dots you see in all the fluff, that's the seed. And that's just to help it carry on the wind, of course. Wide dispersal. And it's quite a unique little strategy. There's some really cool videos on mass propagation of these. And they kind of use like Dyson hoovers and things to kind of separate it all off. And the second that the fluff touches water, apparently the seed and the fluff separate. It's quite remarkable. So that helps to get it immediately onto the ground, and that tiny little seed starts germinating. And I've got lots of willow growing all over the Croft now on disturbed ground from this year. It's been a very good year for it. So people see that as a kind of almost a pest species as it grows. But almost all the willows will have some kind of fluff like that. From the female flowers, and you'll see it. And you can gather that very quickly. You can just grab bunches of it and stick it in a bag. I say if you're going down commercially, you can ask your partner. In my case, well, I can take the Dyson outside to hoover out a couple of willow seeds. Usually, the answer is no. I just clear that for you. So you're just not going to do it by hand, and then you can just sow that readily, and that takes so well. So willow is so easy to grow in so many ways, from cuttings and from seed. And then on the right, you've got elm, and that's just turning from green to brown. There's little wing seeds, kind of with a bit of a bump in the middle. Just get them under a kind of half a centimetre of compost. And then germination rates are quite poor, but if you've got handfuls of them, you're going to get large numbers, and they grow quite quickly. So that's quite nice to get elm. For us, wych elm it does have Dutch elm disease up here, but it's quite scarce in our region. So that's why I kind of covered up how people are feeling about elm, the different elms. But for us, it's kind of a good tree to be propagating.
Can I just jump in with a couple of questions, please? Does the ripeness, the question came up when we were looking at the seed, the red seed.
Yes.
I can't remember what it was called. That's terrible. But does the ripeness influence the germination rates? Perhaps the pigmentation can cause something.
Well, that's the next thing I'm coming on to, so I can cover that one with that. Is there any other questions?
And there was a question just in your live seeds slide about is there any reason not to include beech seeds?
Beech seeds they're a nut, and so I don't class them as a live seed. So they would be one winter, or I think the same again. So I'll come on to nuts in just a minute before that. So they'll be lumped in with that. So brilliant. Thank you for the
Thank you.
So fleshy fruits and berries. This is kind of one of the main seeds that folk know, and mostly they're kind of red berries, as we've just kind of touched on there. You're in a bit of a race in most cases. I saw bullfinches today eating rowan berries, and people think of like the autumn as time for like the thrushes coming in, redwings and fieldfares and blackbirds and mistle thrushes kind of stripping the trees. But the bullfinches, the chaffinches, the song thrushes will be starting now. A lot of the cherries would have gone already. You're probably too late if you're going to be looking for the cherries for this year, but our rowan berries are just turning red. And that's kind of a sign for them to be eaten. So what I don't know is are those seeds in it now, even though some of the seeds are green or kind of purpley green, just about ready to turn? Are they underripe? Will they still germinate? I don't know. They probably will in a lot of cases, but just a case of just waiting if you can. And with most rowans and hollies and hawthorns, you can have plenty of opportunity to get those. The tree is sending a signal that it's ripe when it's red. So I'd imagine that's when the seed is fully ripe as well. So I think I would wait for the berries to be fully mature. But I say you're in a race with the birds. And so things like cherries in particular, you just got to wait, and they can be green kind of turning a bit yellow. But even then the thrushes will be eating them. So that's a bit of a tricky one. So in commercial operations, they would kind of have their own mother trees. They'd have their own trees. They can have controlled environments and they can pick their own, and the birds they can't have this tree, they'll be netted off or contained, so you can propagate it that way. Whereas rounds, there'll be thousands of seeds almost all over the shop. Same applies to the white beams. The elder roses, they'll be coming soon. Elderberries should be turning for us. They're just green now, I think. In most cases, it might be black down south, maybe not quite yet. Holly, and even things like ivy and honeysuckles, well, they're all from berries, and it's the same kind of treatment for those, just kind of picking them when they're ripe. With ivy, it'll be a black seed, and that's usually late in the winter for us up here. And then the processing is up to you how much you do it. Of course, most of these are eaten by birds, and then they're pooped out on their way across the country. That's how these rounds get into all these fence posts and get into all these gullies and things up in the mountains. Of course, it's just from roosting birds spreading them around. So do you need to remove the flesh? Do you need to treat them? Do you need to do anything to mimic that? It's like, well, you can do, but most of these are going to be in the ground for 1 or 2 winters, and they're going to rot off anyway. That's the whole, actually a lot of them just fall from the trees and will still germinate just fine. But if you're going to be controlling the process and wanting to move it on, then yes, just kind of remove the flesh. It's kind of good. You can get all the seed contained in one area, and you can see what you've got to work with as well. And so removing the flesh depends how many you've got. And say on the bottom right there, you can pick that amount of rowan. Those are from our trees. That's 10 minutes picking for the trees for us here. And very, very quickly, you can just mash that down with a pole, or if you could do it by hand if it's a smaller number. You can do it with a potato masher or something. Ask permission from the partner, please. And you could say I'm in trouble for certain things with my seeds. So crushing down the berries, and they won't harm the seeds. They find they are tough. They are really tough. You can just kind of crush away, and then use water to kind of float all the materials away. And you can get into a habit, you'll be very, very brutal with it as well, because the seeds are heavy. You will lose certain seeds if you're doing it very quickly, but that bucket there, if you just mash that down, I use a fence post to be honest, I just crush into it, and with a hose pipe of water, and then really kind of swish it around. The seeds will sink to the bottom, and you'll, within sort of 10 minutes, be pretty tired, but you'll have a huge amount of seed in that bucket. And of course, things like rowans and elders and things, you can be using these as products. If you're cooking them and denaturing them, and to making products for syrups or whatever, let's say for roses or elders and juices, then if you cook them, it probably will denature them. So you've got to think of whether you want to take the seeds out first. If you're taking the seeds out, that's great, nice and viable. And are you going to clean them religiously? Are you going to really kind of scrub them down? You can do, but that depends if you want to kind of store it inside. I say you can also store it in your fridge as well. It's possible to do that. I do most of my stuff outside, and just keep it outside, so I don't have to overthink it. But if you really want to control the whole process, then it's important to clean the seed down to kind of stop any kind of secondary rot with that. You see the picture in the top right there, that's hawthorn. That's taken in February. So you can think of like hawthorn as a species that is loved by the birds. It's like, well, it kind of is, but the berries, they're not that palatable, seemingly. I think they need to have a frost on them before things eat them. Same as holly can last a long time into the winter as well. Rounds will be gone mostly early on. The hawthorn you can pick late on. And the fact it's had a frost on it, in fact, sometimes the hips and seeds are black. It doesn't make any difference. Just go for it. I use the term stratifying there. I'll come onto that in just a second. So that's fruits and berries. So all the same. Just treat them all the same. That's nice and easy. Then you don't have to kind of think about individual rules. Just kind of get it all mashed down, get the seeds out, and then you can treat them all the same.
Can I just clarify, does the pre-treatment mean that you are, you include putting the seeds in the fridge to break the dormancy?
Yeah, so I put that before explaining, so I am coming onto that as well. So I put that in the wrong order, so apologies. I'll mention pre-treatment in the next little bit.
Okay, and then just to add on to that, if you were going to try that, would you need to remove the flesh from the fruit and berries? So that's that.
Yes. If you're going to try and do things in the fridge and things and stuff, you definitely want to be removing excess moisture and the fruit, because it'll get pretty manky, pretty moldy pretty quick, even though it's quite cold. Definitely want to avoid having that. Again, you won't be popular with your partner if you've got manky seeds in a bag rotting at the bottom of your fridge. Again, I learned from experience on these things. Winged seeds. Winged seeds. So these are things like sycamores, of course. The helicopters used to those kind of seeds. But also includes things like ash as well, and elms. And this is when they typically want to fall from the tree. They're kind of turning a bit brown. Things like ash, they hang on the tree. There's ash on the left-hand side there, and there's sycamores on the right. So they're ready to drop there. You can divide those, and they'd happily fly. And then, do you need to kind of trim those off? It's like, no, just get them all contained together and get them stratified. Also, cover stratification and storage of those in a minute. And then just that's from the last slide as well. Holly as well. That's quite a good thing to do at Christmas as well. If you're doing holly wreaths and things like that, you can then just have the berries afterwards as well. That'd be good. It's about four seeds in each holly, so a good way of doing it. And then nuts. So just for this purpose, I'm covering hazel and oak, but that does include things like beech and hornbeam and things as well like that. So lots of kind of more traditional conkers, chestnuts, horse chestnuts. They're all in the kind of same category as this. So you've got harvest these when going from green to brown again, and you can take them from the tree or from the ground. But a lot of the ones that are falling now, say about now, certainly for hazels, they won't necessarily be viable, but you can find out, and there's a little test to do that. But again, you're in a race against nature on this one, so don't take too many, but certainly you've got to watch yourself that they haven't all gone. Certainly if it's quite a poor seeding year, you might struggle. And things like squirrels and jays and mice, they'll cache. So they don't eat all of them straight away, they grab them and then they have their own hiding places. That's how the forests and things move. They're very good at propagating the forest, of course, because they forget or they perish over winter, and those can then germinate on. A good time for getting nuts and things like that, because in a lot of our areas we have deer grazed or stock grazed landscapes. It's very difficult to reach up into the trees to actually get all these nuts. So you're kind of relying on windfall. And we get autumn storms, certainly around September and October, we get our first kind of autumn storms. That's a great time to go out, and they're all on the ground, and there's no way that the voles and mice and things can kind of catch up. So you're in competition then. But some years you can fill a bucket in no time. Hazelnuts will be turning now, and so you can start looking for those. They'll come off quite easily from the husks. They're in a little husk, and you can unpop them very easily. And if it still sticks and still kind of green, probably not ready, but it still will likely germinate anyway. But it just makes it easier for you for collecting. So they're coming up fairly soon. They're not so much in the way of food within them, as well as like commercial hazelnuts, but there is still a live kernel in there. And if it doesn't have a kernel, or the kernel is very small, then it likely won't germinate, and those will float. And so you can do that with acorns and hazelnuts. You can float them before you store them to save having duffers, basically ones that almost certainly won't germinate. So that kind of helps. And keep the sinkers, and you can stratify them, or you can just plant them straight into a pot. Hazelnuts you can store, or you can plant straight away, up to you. But with oak and the acorns, exactly the same process. You collect them a bit later. They're starting to turn a bit brown in more September, October for us up northwest Scotland. Float them, keep the sinkers. But with acorns, as I touched on earlier, they send down a tap root almost straight away. They send down a white root straight out, sometimes 3, 4, 5 inches before Christmas. Sometimes just a tiny little bit of a crack in the seed. But if you gather all those together in a bag or in a container, then they're likely to get a bit of a tangle. So you want to put them where they're going to be growing for the first year. Usually they don't like being disturbed too much. So get them where they're going to grow. Maybe put, say, 3 in a pot, and then just pick 2 of the weaker ones out, or hope to germinate. And you've got one right away there. But please protect. I've learned the hard way from this as well. Protect from voles and mice. They can be very clandestine in their methods of getting them, but you really have to protect them. and mice are very, very clever and cunning. So it's not an obvious sign that you've been raided as well. You can go in and they've all been had. And I'm sure if you're a gardener, you've got peas and things like that, it's exactly the same as well. Sometimes you can see signs of diggings, but with this, not so much. And vole mesh, I'll just show you on the next slide. So that's kind of commercial grade stuff you can use. You can buy it on Amazon from horticultural suppliers and things. That's 6 millimeters. That's the grade you need to stop voles and mice getting through. That's tiny, but that's what it needs. And you can think, well, they won't be able to get a hazelnut through there. No, but they can kind of eat it, and they can then come back the next night and do the same again, and do the same again. And of course, if they've got a winter supply there, then that's fine. That's 100 nights worth of supply right there. So those are hazelnuts in 3 per pot under there. I think those sheets were a few pounds. I think I've got like 10, and as you see, I've used in a few other areas. Acorns and hazelnuts there. So just about the right kind of, the one on the left, I see the acorns, they look green, but you can tell by the leaf of the acorn, I think that's almost November, that is up here when that's turned. But those came away from the husk very easily, so they were perfect, and those hazelnuts just ready. A lot of them will be looking like that fairly soon now, and get a nice warm autumn now. Just show the acorns and how I prepared them. Fish boxes again, as you'll see. So these have been washed up on the shore, and I just filled this with compost and some local soil, so just soil from around and about. Some rocks at the bottom for a bit of drainage, and a lot of wood chip there. I think it looks like some old wood chip I had. So you can grow in anything really, just mimicking almost kind of forest floor. And then as you see on the left, I really protected those well. I got that mesh, covered it with stones. I blocked every single hole, every possibility of theft was covered. And then in spring, and these were quite late, by April, they came up. And those are the same 2 boxes on the right there, just from a different angle. And you can see it's about 100 acorns that have germinated just fine. So that's great. And once they're up, they're typically not taken by pests. So you're away, because the goodness has gone out of the kernel of the nut. So not so attractive.
And Andy's just commenting to say that sorry, I'm reading it off the other computer.
Yeah.
Homebase sells the mesh as rodent and snake mesh, and it's the cheapest he's found. So that's a good tip.
Thank you. Yes. You got watching. It's not rat proof. Is something else. That's slightly different grade again. That's like 10 mils or something like that. It's amazing what they can get their little skulls through. They can compress it all down. But yes, so it is available out there. But you do want stuff for mice and voles. And here's hazels and hazelnuts. So on the left, so 2 different methods. So on the left, I've stratified those seeds, waited for them to germinate, and then I've planted them on into little trainers there individually. Those are all growing well. The success rate is high because they germinated, and I protected them, looked after them. On the right, I sowed 3 in the autumn, and they've all come up. Part of my thing as well, I'm a devil. I'm sure a lot of you are the same when you're growing plants, is that you don't actually have the heart to then kill 2 perfectly good trees or try and pull them up. You don't want to be pulling them up out of there. You'd be disturbing the roots of the other ones too much, or snipping them off. So I tend to let them go on, and you shouldn't do that really, because you have one healthy plant ready to plant out in the first year, or you end up with 3 kind of plants that have only got halfway up, and you have to wait another year or 2 for that. And then you may have to plant them together. Of course, the roots will all be tangled in, but hazel's often growing quite clumps and things anyway, so that's not. But you really should be just kind of thinning down to an individual plant to play with. I'll just cover cones. I know I'm running out of kind of the 4 to 5 o'clock time, so apologies if we've got to go. I think I've covered a fair bit on that there, but I'll cover cones and then stratification on that now. Cones, you're talking Scots pine, all conifers as well, so all conifers that we know, including non-native ones, and things like alder, and then birch. It's kind of an honorary cone as it is, and they start soon. Birch is already starting now. You can collect that as a seed, and I'll show you pictures of what that looks like and how to do that. Alders will be then coming next in the autumn, typically. Scots pines on the holder, cones are green now, and they're turning brown over winter. You'll see cones on most trees now, and you'll be collecting them just as they start to turn brown, and you can then dry them carefully, indoors. And that works very well. You can just dry them over winter in a shed or something as well, but best is to kind of do it indoors, a bit quicker. And then things like bags or tins, perfect, and just give it a shake, and you'll be amazed at the seed that comes out. Once it's dried inside, you can look at little cones and think there's nothing in there. And some pine cones will have 20 seeds in them. Some alder cones maybe 40 or 50, and birch can be 200 in just a very tiny amount. You just don't need much at all. Try not to dry them out too much. Again, they're very delicate seeds. They're very high oil seeds, and they can dry out and they can rot very quickly as well. So the two extremes. So the best way of doing that, I think, is just going to get them where they're meant to be, which is just outside. As long as you know where they are and they're kind of controlled, you can do it like that. Or you can prepare the seed and look after it nicely, and then store it carefully, and then you've got more of a control come the spring. You can then choose to get them ready for germination when you want, rather than let nature do it. But that's different methods. Again, depends on the numbers you're doing. So for me, with those seeds, once I get those out, I'll get them out in the autumn. I will just sow them in a seed tray, just a seed tray full of kind of compost and vermiculite, and just label it. I won't need to cover that really. There's nothing that's going to take that seed, and then as long as you know where it is for the spring, and it should be just fine. There's alder cones on the left, and they're later on in the winter. Actually, that's much later on. But if you look carefully at those brownie cones, there's little kind of flecks of copper and bronze almost going horizontally through it. And those are the seeds, and right through winter, and they'll stay there, and they'll typically drop off when it gets dry, really dry in spring, and that's perfect time for germination, of course. So that's kind of their natural strategy. They'll drop out throughout the winter as well, and then carried into watercourses and things like that in periods of heavy rain, and so they can spread out that way. They float older seeds, so that's a good strategy for them. And then that's birch on the right. So it's kind of like an honorary cone, really. It's almost like a catkin, but that is all seeds. You break those apart, and it's just hundreds and hundreds of seeds. You can get that now on the right-hand side. That's what they'd be looking like now. In a lot of cases, you can just bag that up. You can get so much birch seed in a short space of time. It can be quite galling. Sometimes you can collect a whole load one winter, and maybe it's just not fertile. Maybe it just doesn't work. And then you can go along a kind of gravelly road, and there could be 100 birch seedlings just kind of popping up, and it's just kind of waving in your face. And that's just nature, really. You can give it the best compost, but sometimes it just needs a kind of a bit of a chant in some gravel somewhere, and that's how it takes. So you don't have to be too kind to them. And here's pines as they come up. That's lovely when they come out. They come a lovely shape. So that's just exactly what I've said. Get them out the cones, get them outside, and perfect. Stratification, I've used that term in this a couple of times, and that literally means kind of layers. But in this case, it's you're just storing the seed over winter, and you're allowing the natural dormancy to break, so it's kind of ready for germination. So you're just controlling the situation. You want kind of a free draining material to store the seed in. And so it's kind of like a free draining pot, and you can kind of put a bit of gravel and pot shells to make sure it really does drain at the bottom. You don't want it kind of where water's pooling at all. And then whatever mix you use, it all works. All you're doing is mimicking soil and kind of a free draining soil. So you can tell me any kind of prescription, it will likely work. But recommended to use kind of perlite and vermiculite. I'll show you a picture of that. That's a horticultural product. Or sand. Mixed in with compost and seed or wood chip, something like that, just so it's not too heavy, not too wet, and a bit free draining, and it's good for the roots to kind of get in. If you catch them when they're germinating as well, it's not binding too much. And you could then layer it. So that's a kind of term stratification. You can layer it in say a bucket or a container. But I just mix it all in. I think most would kind of mix it all in, and you could put a kind of a little bit of sand on top of it. But usually it's you don't need to do anything like that. And then, allow it to be wintered, allow it to be outside. Some seeds likely do need the extremes of the cold and the warmth to kind of break their dormancy. That's why it might take a bit longer. So if you tuck it in against a shed somewhere, it might be more of a stable climate. Some seeds will be just fine, but some will be another couple of years to break their hard seed coats to kind of start the rot processes and things. So allow them to be weathered, allow them to get frozen, allow them to dry out, allow them to get the winter rains. You don't want to be covering them up, kind of getting dry rot inside there. And my experience as well, please label everything, because so stratification can be 1 or 2 winters, and you can think, oh, I'll remember that, or you write it on in a kind of permanent marker, and then after 2 winters, so you just pull a label up, and it's all weathered away. You've got nothing left on it, and then you just got to kind of wait and see what comes up once you tip it out. But with all of that, again, just protect from pets and rodents and things like that. Again, if you get things like hens or whatever, it's kind of scratching away, it's the last thing you want. So do kind of cover it up. And if it's a desirable seed, then cover it with a mesh. But if not, don't bother covering. You can just maybe put a couple of rocks in there. And so depending on the prescription, if it's hawthorn or rose, then it's 2 years. And if it's around, it can be 1 year. So label it to know when you're going to be germinating it or trying to lay it out. So that's the material on the left there. So that was hazelnuts in sand, worked just fine. And the germination rate was high. You see I was taking out the germinating ones on the top tray there, and then just tipping it straight back into the mix and leaving it for another few weeks and then doing the same thing again. You don't have to do that. You can be at, say, as soon as some are starting to germinate, you can just tip them out onto a seed bed or start planting them up and assume that most are going to plant. You look at germination rates, they're pretty high. Certainly hazelnuts are like 80 or 90%. Assume that most are going to grow, I think, is my tip for most folk, because you end up with trees growing all over the place. That's a picture of perlite on the left. Also, in the right-hand picture, the left is perlite, the right is vermiculite. That's kind of a heat-treated rock substrate, which is very light and is very good for drainage. Allows just the right amount of moisture. You can get bags of this. You can get sacks. If you're going to do it on a big scale, you can get a sack of it ordered online quite easily. So the pre-treatment, which I'm just coming on to now, sorry for being late on the pre-treatment. This is safe for controlling the process. So you can control the seed, you can keep it in check until you want it to germinate. And so that can be when it's a convenient time for you, when you think it's a better time for the plant. And it can be a bit of a pain, of course. It's obviously, it's like having a pet, same as like those who are growing plants as well. If you've got little baby trees, you need to be looking after them, you need to be there for it. And if you're going to be going on holiday for a few weeks, it can be very difficult to keep that climate controlled just as your tiny baby little trees are coming up. So it's kind of a helpful way of keeping it controlled. You need to clean and air dry that seed to do that. And then you can store it in a shed, in a bag, away from pests, and to allow the air to get to it. So not in a sealed plastic bag, it'll rot in there. But fridge is an alternative for that. But if it's clean and dry seed, then there shouldn't be any mold in there. You can store it in there. And then for the pre-treatment aspect, to kind of really kickstart the germination, you often want to soak the seed. That depends on different prescriptions of individuals. Soaking the seed first often will help. And then keeping it in a damp substrate, usually in the cold. And so they can say you can put it in kind of a sand or a vermiculite mix, which is damp but not wet, in the fridge for say 6 weeks before you're ready to sow, something like that. There's different prescriptions, and I'll show you the links for individual species if you're keen to do this process. And the aim of that is just to improve the germination rate. You'll still get germinating seed almost whatever you do. If you want high germination rates, that's fine. But if you've got things like birch, then well, do you need to? You're going to get so many plants that are likely to come up, or alders and things like that. But it does control the time. I'd say birch and alder, they work best with this pre-treatment, which kicks them in. So I call them hardy pioneer species, the ones that really colonize bare ground. The pines, the birch, the alders, they're particularly good for the pre-treatment. But yeah, they're also easy to forget as well. And you can be around about April and then you kind of remember something and then you haven't started your seed off and then you've got to go through the process again. You'll still be able to catch up, but you don't want to leave it too late. Whereas naturally outside, it would have already germinated and started. So just got to kind of keep these things on a calendar or reminders. So easy to forget. If they're outside and doing their own thing, then that's fine. You just kind of notice. And then for germination, yeah.
Sorry, Phil, just one quick question. Fridge over the freezer. Don't put things in the freezer. You
can do things for freezer. The freezer is kind of like a shock treatment, and some prescriptions may call for that. You might see it in a few things of trying to break dormancy, particularly with some of the harder species of 2 winters. It might be a kind of a technique for breaking the more deeply dormant seed. So we kind of touched on juniper and things like that, and hawthorns. I've not done it myself, but I know it's something you can try and do, to try and stress the seed, try and break it out. But for general storage, you don't need to put it in the freezer. No, you can just kind of keep it in the fridge. But some seeds like broom and gorse, I didn't really touch those today. They're deeply dormant and they've got a very hard seed coat, and they can be stressed by frost or by extreme temperature. You can a good way of cracking the seed coat for that is to pour boiling water on things like those seeds, or to stress them in the freezer till it cracks, and then even sandpaper to kind of or to kind of really kind of grind them together to break the seed coat. Otherwise, they can stay in the soil for 10 years and then they're ready to germinate. That's how kind of broom and gorse can get out of hand for some people. If you want to plant it, then you might want to just pour boiling water on it. That's one of the things I've seen, and it worked for me. And it very cools very quickly, and it cracks the seed coat, and they're ready to germinate that next spring. But it's better just to kind of in a controlled environment, have your own, you can have it over the several years. But if you're using the same substrates year after year and then mixing and then putting different seeds the next year, then of course you're going to get all sorts of randoms popping up. Very much so, yeah. So germination really varies on species, and some could germinate in deep winter, some could be later on. But you just need to keep checking. So if you stratified your seed in a bucket or in a mixture, just need to keep looking at it and tip it out, check through it, and then put it back in again for those that aren't there. So you can choose when to then sow the whole lot en masse. So if you're on a seed bed, you can just tip the whole pot out and just spread it out with a rake, spread it out with your hands, depends on the scale. Lightly cover again, just lightly cover and water, and then you're away. And that sort of stuff. Or you can start picking individual seeds out, put them into pots or trays, and just cover those in just a sec. Many species don't move until May, just wait, and so many years after that. Even species that aren't supposed to be dormant can be dormant. But if you leave it too late and you've got 50 hazelnuts in one little pot, then they're going to be a tangle if you've left it too late, and you could be snapping roots off, and it's going to be very difficult to move. So that's the kind of the fallback. I think that nuts, in particular, if you've forgotten about them. And once some of those roots snap, if you're faced with something like this, it's going to be very difficult for you to tease that out and plant that on. That's going a bit too late. So that's the disadvantage of stratifying like this, is you've got to be there and checking regularly. I'll just quickly cover, and I'm running out of time desperately, but just cover the different types of cells for growing, because it depends if you're doing it from home and what budget you've got. Most people often do it in pots. Pots you can get obviously cheaper en masse. There's lots of places you can get them, horticultural wholesalers online. You can get large numbers. If you're just buying sort of 10 pots from somewhere, it can be quite expensive, but you can get 100 pots much cheaper. Maybe you can share them with a neighbor, or kind of get a bigger order in if you're doing that. If you can sow straight into a pot and then thin it out to have one growing tree, if you can keep it at the pot that you're going to plant it out in, so think ahead of where it's going to be in a year or two, then that's great. You've done very little work. Something like a hazelnut or an acorn, if you just put it into a pot, let it grow on, and it's ready after a couple of years. All you've got to do is look after it, but you don't have to keep moving it around, potting it on, things like that. It's nice and easy. I'll show the pictures there, kind of square pots as well. If you're doing large numbers, you're trying to pack them in, really, because things like round pots are not so efficient for watering, and they let a lot of air through them, so they dry out a lot quicker. Depends if you've got kind of whatever setup you've got for your pots. And then, of course, if you move pots around, very easy just to kind of pass on to people and move them around and carry them around. Quite awkward. You can't carry large numbers, but they're easy to kind of move around individually. My disadvantage, my main thing of having pots, is that a large amount of soil. If you've got them in the ground for a year, or got them out for a year or two, then you're going to get a lot of weeds blown into that as well. And you're going to have to constantly keep weeding, because there's a large surface area of soil, so there's lots of weeds germinating in that. And if it's sat in the pot for 2 years, then you've got to really keep at it, and it can get out of hand very quickly, because you've usually got quite a rich soil. It's just perfect for so many species. As I say, trees are very thirsty, and pots dry out very quickly. So summer. So like today for us here, we've had 2 dry days here with a bit of a wind. That could be enough to dry out some of the pots here. I need to be very, very careful of that. So I'm going to water some of my trees tonight. And so you need to kind of think about your water supply if you're doing it in pots. And if it's something that's around your house and you're doing your plants anyway, there's no difficulty. You can water at the same time. But they do take up a lot of space, and kind of maybe you want to stick them in a corner somewhere. But with some of the deep rooting species, you can be very careful. If you don't move those pots very often, then you can go to lift a pot up and it's stuck to the ground. The roots have gone straight in, not just left a mat. They've actually just kind of anchored into the ground. You've got to snap the root off. So just do mind out for that, because they will seek out nutrients and water further down. So you see there, square pots versus round pots on the left. So much easier for watering and containment on the left. I put that in a washed up crate. There's little sycamores there. Whereas on the right there, those hazels, the air is getting through that all the time. Very difficult to water, kind of inefficient watering, and you can more direct watering. And then the air is blowing through that all of the time. The circulation is not good for drying them out. And that's a result of drying out there. As a hazel, it just carks it because it was just too dry. And the other plants that you're seeing are quite yellow. They're stressed, and that was stress through heat. It could be through to lack of nutrients as well. And we'll just cover that in just a second. And just kind of like on upcycling, recycling pots and things like that. If they're for 1 year, it's absolutely fine. And you see, I've cut cartons and yogurt pots there, and you can do anything. That's great for doing that. If it's more than 1 year, if it's 2 winters, I find they do fall apart. Almost all the plastics do fall apart, and that's the last thing you want, of course, is bits of plastic going everywhere. So 2 winters outside for a lot of those pots will be too much. So other brands of noodles are available, but pot noodle pots do seem to last. I guess it's because they're kind of heat tested or boiling water. They seem to cope better, whereas some of these other milk cartons, they just disintegrate, and that's such a shame. You have to repot those, so that's a learning experience there. So pot noodle, those kind of heat treated ones are okay. Cell trays and root trainers. So this is how it's done commercially in most cases. That's a picture of a root trainer there. You might have seen them for kind of growing on garden plants. You can sow a seed directly into the cell, and then that cell will do everything that the tree needs in a very small and contained environment. You think it wouldn't be enough for a tree, but it is. It's absolutely fine until it's ready to plant out. So that's a very efficient way of doing it as well. And from those, when they're grown in plugs like that, you can plant them at any time. Same as in pots as well. You can plant those even in the summer. I don't recommend planting it in the summer, but you can plant it out in the summer. Less surface area of soil, they're all bunched in, so there's very little weeding, the seeds can't get in there, and then they all grow up together. So it's competition. It's like growing in a forest. So they all grow up tall and straight very quickly, and if you're watering them or feeding them, then much easier as well. And you can then reuse these, of course, as well. You can reuse the cell trainers repeatedly. The difficulty with those, as you may have seen if you're online, is blinking expensive, a lot of them. I'll show you some of them. And those root trainers there, personally myself, I find the plastic a bit flimsy and a bit rubbish, and after a few years, a lot of them are starting to split. There are better ones out there that don't open like a book like that. You can just kind of pull the plug out and it just comes out as a oneer. I'll show you the pictures of those in a minute. And these are designed to be air pruned. That means the roots, when they get to the bottom of these, they find the air rather than water, and then the roots die. And so the roots then grow strongly within the plug rather than trying to find a way out at the bottom. So to do that, you need to kind of have it elevated and let the air get underneath it, either every day, all the time, or just now and again to stop. You don't have to be killing roots. And this is best done in like a controlled environment, so on a bench suspended on a kind of mesh, where the humidity is controlled as well, and the moisture. So that's going to say why it's a commercial operation in most cases, but you can do it yourself. So this is some of the ones that I've got. This is my tree nursery as it is. And those are pines growing on the left there with a few willows growing in, and so they'll be in there until they're ready to plant out. So those are just new ones this year. That's an old picture, so they're a bit bigger now. And on the right, that was then all sown, various hazels and everything ready to come up, and that's very green now. But look how many hundreds of trees there are in that little bit there. Very high success rates, and of course you can replant if something dies. You can just lift up the tray and put another one in there. You can put a replacement in. So that's hundreds and hundreds of plants in that's 2 pallets covering that area there. So it doesn't take up a huge amount of space and very easy for watering. And that's more of a commercial operation. That's a Trees for Life, a Dundregan, and so you can do it en masse, particularly if you've got volunteer help to kind of pop them on. But the bigger commercial operations will have tunnels and beds that are going on for miles doing this. So cell grown, you'll see as part of the description. And then seed beds, the kind of the last way of growing on. So this can be like a vegetable bed, and just open ground, and you can be putting large numbers into the ground, large numbers of seed, and then the roots can do as they like, and they're more free to just kind of get going and growing quicker. And you can plant them as densely as you want, and then the kind of strongest will survive. And I use fish boxes for this purpose as well. So contained fish boxes with deeper soil, and then I can control that nicely rather than out and about. The difficulty is the weeding of actually having a bed, because the weeds just kind of get into the soil. The weeds are in the soil already in most cases, and then you're at a competition, a race with the trees. So it's quite a lot of effort, and then establishment effort for beds. And this is how bare-rooted plants are produced. You often see cell-grown, which I've just covered in the last one, or pot-grown. Bare-rooted are grown in the ground, and they'll be uplifted and they'll be bare-rooted. So they won't have the kind of mud around them. They'll just be bare-rooted, and so they're a bit more difficult. They need to be planted in winter, often to kind of slotted into the ground somewhere. And a lot of commercial operations, they will uproot a lot of their plants. It's like an oak. They will have the oak in the ground for a year, but then they'll lift it at the end of the first winter, snip off the bottom of the root and put it back in again, because what they don't want to pull it up is an 18-inch root, which they're going to have to struggle to get into the ground. So they prune the roots. They've got machines that can do that as well. They subsoil, they cut underneath to do that. So it's advantages and disadvantages, but things like a fish box or a container, then the roots are a bit more contained within that. And you can have large numbers within that. So again, here's my kind of beds, my fish boxes here. So a real range of trees, very easy for watering. You don't have to worry about watering them so much as well, because you've got deeper soil there. Most plants that are wild growing aren't going to be too stressed with a couple of days of sun, whereas in a pot they will, or in a cell they will as well. They'll run out of moisture. With this, there'll be plenty of moisture at the bottom. And you can see the range of stuff there. Advantage of this as well is you can just uproot individual plants as they're getting ready to pot out. And if you think, this I'm going to leave for another year, or wait for next winter, then that works as well. So that's a real advantage of contained kind of beds in this way. And you can do it with a raised bed. You can kind of build it up with wood, of course, and have that, and you get large numbers of trees in a very short space of time. And here's hawthorn. This is great. This is 2 years in the ground, 2 years stratifying in a bucket. You have no idea what's going to come up. And then look, that's the seed spread there, and that's just 1 year's worth. So there'll be more coming after that as well, because it can be 3 or 4 years in the ground. And if you can get half of those to germination, half of those to planting out, and that's a huge amount of hedging right there, isn't it? So that's great. Very easy to collect, and hawthorn are easy to gather. So it's kind of a good starting one. I know a lot of people are interested in growing their own hedging. Plenty of holes on the hawthorns. All you've got to do is just gather them in a bucket, keep them for a couple of winters. Works quite well. There's alder on the left there. So the first year I weeded that religiously when it was tiny and wee. Second year, they weren't quite ready to plant out, so I left them. But as soon as it started bolting the second year, I just let the weeds grow as well, because those trees are away now, and I will plant them this winter. So I'm not worried about the weeds within that. Those trees that are in there, so maybe 15 or so, they're perfect. They're great. And people are asking about fish boxes. Some people may not have seen fish boxes on the beach. Well, you can get in touch with me. There's plenty of beaches up here. You've got to go off the beaten track a little bit, but they're great. So if I see a fish box, that's great. I grow a lot of veg in that as well. Lots of that. So our garden is just full of those, just reusing those that I can find. But it's about a mile from the road on a southwest facing beach. You'll find plenty of those, and that's on slate. It's awful to see, but at least you can kind of make use of those big bits of plastic. It's good to reuse them. I'm just going to care of those on. We don't have to kind of come too much on the care, but you want to be waiting for the first true leaves. If you're going to transplant them, don't try and transplant. Same as with garden plants, veg plants. Don't move them too early. Let them get up and established a little bit, first true leaves, and you can then just tease them out if you're going to put them into pots, or if you're going to put them into trainers. And you do have to kind of watch how you're planting them and where you're planting them. They've got a very clear line on the stem, and you really want to watch where you're planting. Some veg you can just jam in the ground at different heights, but not trees. You want to get them at the right height. And you want to, again, protect those from strong wind and sun once you've transplanted them, and not overwater and not have them too damp. So damping off, which is a term for basically rotting of the stem at ground level, is a real problem for a lot of them. So that's overwatering as well. And so if you're looking for good root growth, of course, you don't want to have too much water. You don't want to have too rich a soil. You want them to be sending roots down, and so that needs to be kind of poor soil, or not overly rich, not manured soil necessarily, and don't overwater for that. And then, as I say, thin early. Please just thin them as they come up. You've got to be really just pull them out. I know it's destroying trees in some cases. Maybe you can plant them on elsewhere, but just for the greater good, it's worth it. And then label everything. Do you feed them? Yes, you probably do. Ideally, you can try and get a tree established in a year and get it away. As soon as it sits for more than 1 year, then it starts to struggle. That soil in that pot, of course, has had however many feet of rain lashed through it over winter. A lot of the nutrients are gone. There's not much in the way of nutrient cyclers like worms in the pots and things to keep things ticking over. There's not much in the way of mycorrhizal fungi, native fungi for the species. So you struggle in the second year. So you need kind of feed, and that could be any kind of feed. You can make your own home compost. You can buy other feeds. You just kind of grow more ones from garden centres. They work just fine, and it will make a difference. It really will make a difference for the growing on of the trees to get them up and away, and then they're ready to plant out. And so people often ask about mycorrhizal, and that's the kind of the fungi that help the trees to find their own nutrients. And you can buy that online. You'll see it advertised online, and it's you can spend a lot of money on things like that. I would avoid that and spending money on things like that. What I would recommend is maybe taking a little bit of soil from a well-established tree where you're taking the nuts from or the seeds from, because that tree there is going to be healthy and it's going to have a lot of the mycorrhizal in that soil there. So that'd be a good substrate to then move on, and it will help the tree develop. And that has been tested. It does seem to make a big difference. And then growing on trees, once they're up and away, you want to be keeping mulching or weeding them at least, because they will be in a lot of competition for those nutrients and water in there, and it will make a big difference for those little trees. Is to get them, I say, up and away, and they can start promisingly and then really slow down, and they can go a bit yellow. They can just stop, and sometimes you think, oh, they'll wait the next year, and then nothing happens next year either. They're not necessarily pot bound; they just run out. But the timing of growing, I say, just look at that time frame there. That's if I collect hawthorn seed now, it could be a hedge in maybe 2028. So either that, or you're buying a pound a shot or 50p a shot on the numbers from a wholesaler somewhere. So yes, there's great advantages, but you need to be realistic of the time frame. So you need to start now. But so other things like fast growing species, you can have 6 foot in some species in a year. Once they're planted out, it can be amazing. They can just go. So conversely, the other way around. And then here's an example of just a tree that's just struggled. Now it's an oak, really struggled. And that's 2 years. After I leave for 3 years, and you look at the roots, it's like, well, it's fairly root bound, but it's just nutrients. It's run out of nutrients. That's all it is. There's nothing left in that compost for it to kind of push on. You kind of repot that if you're going to do it again. Then you're kind of stuck in a cycle for years. Could you just plant that out now? Probably. It's not very healthy, not very strong plant. Might not do, but you can. If you given it more love in the first year, better soil, more soil, a bigger pot, you would have been better. And is it ready? Just you're looking for a healthy tree, and depend on the ones you buy are often 6 inches or 12 inches, and depends how much love you're going to give it, really. And planting them out winter pretty much, and I say you cell grown, pot grown, you can grow on very quickly, but winter is the best time. When the tree is actually dormant, particularly for bare rooted trees as well, but there's less stress on the plant, less transpiration, less risk of shock when they go in. Moisture is a real factor for that. It lets plants get established a bit better, let the rain kind of get through them. And so just in summary, so just look at on the right there, that's 2 acorns. Again, look at me, I didn't thin again. I didn't follow my own rules on that, but look, there's 2 trees that would be absolutely fine there. I just can't do it. I can't kill an oak tree. I just can't do it. I should have split it early. So maybe 1 per yogurt pot would have been a better idea there. But that's ready to go in the ground. I'll probably just plant those 2 together. I won't bother separating them. I'll just lump them in together. It'll be fine. But a kind of key summary of things: permission. Please seek permission from the landowner. It's good form to do that, depending on how you're collecting seeds and things. Please use native, use local. I stress it on everything. I say it makes such a difference to all the local wildlife as well. They're used to the timings of things here. They're used to the particular strains and varieties. Try and focus on that for growing on. Watch your times, I think, because it can take so long to sort the seeds out in spring with the watering, the pricking out and things. It's a lovely therapeutic thing to do, but it can be at the wrong time for you. So just make sure you've got the time to do that. Get as many as you can for seeds, for cuttings. Just get as many as you can, and that does make a big difference. And cost-wise, it should save you money if you're doing it on the cheap with bits of plastic washed up and recycling yogurt pots and things. But you can really spend some money on good commercial pots and guards and growing on. And yeah, feeds and things like that, and then it can go on for quite a long time, really. And it gets quite addictive. Actually, you can kind of get into it bit by bit. And I've kind of grown my little collection year on year, and just kind of pass it on, and it's quite addictive. And I think you will, once you get the bug of growing trees. And starting with things like hazelnuts and acorns, that's great, and it's great for kids, great for families, of course, as well. To actually go out and collect the seeds, and then to have them germinating in the spring. And you may have seen little kind of glass pots or glass panes that are stuck together, and you can have a seed that germinates through that. And you can see the root growth and development. Have a look at kind of acorn things. That's the great way of starting. And they're foolproof. Everyone can grow it as long as you protect it from the mice. anyone can just grow large numbers of oaks and acorns and things like that very, very easily. I think I'll leave it at that. I've overshot massively, and I hope I'll leave the last couple of questions. I hope there's a few folk left out there not having their tea.
Yeah, we've still got quite a lot of people. A few people have had to leave, and they've sent their apologies for that. So we do have quite a few questions coming in. I'm just going to ask that one because I haven't written that one out. So there's maybe not any particular order to these questions now. So how many years old do beeches have to be planted for hedges?
It's not to say the age of it. You'd be looking at the size of it. So all the hedging that I've planted here on the Croft, I have planted that through membrane. So I planted that through plastic. I don't recommend plastic necessarily, but it is a very good way of mulching the weeds. There are biodegradable membranes and things out there, but you'd be looking at a tree. Ideally, it's kind of like 8 or 10 inches. I think that would be kind of a good height. You know, just kind of really able to just kind of push on in the first year. You can do them shorter, 4 or 5 inches, and you can easily get that in a year's growth with beech. But anything less than that, you're at risk of competition and stress. So I would say about 8 to 10 inches.
Okay, and just a question relating to, this is my own question, sorry, so in case anyone's wondering where it's come from, about a plastic alternative. Have you ever tried wool or seen research about using wool instead of plastic to keep?
I mean, mulching can be done with anything. It can be done with straw, it can be done with wool. There's a lot of things on wool at the moment. Of course, there's a lot of farmers burning wool and things because the price is so terrible once they've kind of processed it all, and it can be very good. We would be using more natural products. Our disadvantage is we've got a lot of chickens, which can be quite good, but they just rake everything away. So they kind of scratch everything. Good for kind of pest control, but also for mulch, you kind of just move it aside en masse. And so it's quite a lot of work. We want to leave it in. And we got a lot of trees in one time. We kind of a spike. That's the thing of growing so many trees. Yourself, you often get 500 trees ready to plant at the same time. And so you kind of got to think of the best strategy. So yes, natural mulches. And then as the years go on, there'll be more and more biodegradable mulches, of course. There's plastic sheetings. You'll have to you'll have to cut out, and then you'll have to try and find a recycling, or they could go to landfill, which is not desirable. So I'm not advocating that, but hopefully there'll be some better solutions. And if you can use natural, if you don't have chickens scratching away at everything, then certainly things like wool would be good, as long as you're not right up against the collar of the tree, so it doesn't kind of sweat and rot off. So it's kind of a little bit of a gap just to kind of let it air through. The straw and cut rushes, cut grass, and not kind of lawn cuttings, but maybe kind of more longer cuttings would do the job. Anything to keep the weeds down.
Great. Now, yeah, so these are the other questions that have come in at various times, so there might be a wee bit of jumping back and forth. Yes. Someone was asking, they have growing on their Croft several thousand birch and other saplings that have naturally seeded.
Yes.
They're looking to thin it. Is it easy enough to dig them up and replant, or I'm guessing the replanting of it, is it worth it compared to just starting again and growing from seed?
No, I know.
So quite spinning, you're pulling some out.
Yeah, there's. If you're doing it in winter, you've got a better chance. If you're just kind of pulling them out, it will bring quite a healthy number of roots with it, and you think, oh, this is going to be okay. But actually, you need to dig into it, because it's all the finer roots that actually do a lot of the hard work. It's not the thicker roots, and so it can kill the plant doing it. So you kind of want to leave it. But sometimes if they're like a gravel road or a forestry road or something, there can be loads growing up in the middle verge. They're a devil to get out easily. I know a lot of folk who go out and get their trees that way as well. And if they're going to be on a bit of waste ground, or somewhere that's going to be weeded or cut or mown or something, then that's great. Again, if you've got someone you know who's got hundreds of birch trees, then yeah, put it out there and just let them know. Come and help yourself. Bring a trowel and get them out. And I would either then transplant them immediately or kind of get them into a pot. But I would just get them into the ground immediately in winter. When all the leaves have gone off.
Okay, great. Now coming to soil types. Yeah. A lady has sandy, stony soil and Scots pine, rowan and birch come through really well. She finds
Yes.
that willow doesn't. What else could you suggest? And then also someone asks about coastal sandy soils. I'm guessing they're kind of similar, sandy and stony coastal areas.
And certain species will struggle. You think naturally oaks and things wouldn't grow in those kind of environments. A lot of trees wouldn't grow in those environments. They have to kind of wait until the woodlands have succeeded a little bit. So until the birch and the pine and alder and things have really kind of developed the soil over a few years. So those species are what we call pioneer species, particularly rocky environments or really heathery environments, somewhere which there's very little soil, peaty environments it can be as well. It can be a real challenge for a lot of the richer trees, the bigger, deep-rooted trees to get established. However, if you've got birch wood or rowan wood, after 10, 15 years, the topsoil is kind of like a brown earth. It's kind of made it a bit more humid. The leaf litter has all fallen down there. The mycorrhizal's kind of developed a bit more, and then those species can go in afterwards. So what you're looking at is for the natural environment to kind of be ready for the trees. You can try and force it and like plant it in with a lot of compost, and it might just kind of be okay as the other trees are growing up. But basically your ground is probably not going to be ready for those species just yet, in a natural succession kind of way. If it's in a garden kind of point of view, then you can definitely micromanage the situation and try and improve the soil with organic matter. The bigger forest trees like oaks and ashes and things, on the whole, they'll want to be in richer soil from the outset, and that's where they naturally spread. And they are slow spreading species that will spread just kind of tens of yards at a time, whereas things like pine will blow on the gales and colonize bare hillsides and bare ground, or sandy soils sort of can be up to a couple of miles away. So it shows the natural succession.
Great. Now, any tips on species pairing?
For
not any specific types of areas, I guess. What might grow well together and not outcompete each other?
In terms of hedging, you kind of you pack them in anyway, and that's what you want. And so for hedging, I would typically be planting kind of like 5 per meter, and so that you're really densely packing it in there, and you can be doing a real mix of species within that. So no, it doesn't matter so much. It's not so much in the complementary planting of species that do grow well together. You can pack them in, and if you're trying to get a shelter belt, you do want a dense amount of planting. And there's not many species that won't grow alongside others. Trees have got amazing ways of communicating and sharing nutrients and things. Almost all of them have ways of helping each other. If one's short of phosphorus and another one's short of nitrogen and potassium, they just seem to be able to communicate amazingly through the mycorrhizal and through the other plants. And so they're quite happy growing. I say the more plants you've got in one area, although there's more competition, they're also the faster they grow. And you can then thin them out later if you so choose to. So you can kind of, again, go with numbers quite early if you can for planting, but there's no real no-nos of what you can plant together. I don't think there's any kind of benefits of complementary planting that I'm aware of, but someone else might be able to chip in on that.
Well, I'll let you know if anything else pops up from any of our participants that are here still. Someone was also asking about the best tree for coppicing in terms of speed for growing, with the intention of using it as a wood fuel.
I think the willows are the main ones they do for biofuels, kind of biomass. But if you're doing it for a stove for yourself, that's not the same as of having a kind of a field of rich willows, because most of those willows are hybrids and they're grown for that purpose, and they're usually kind of harvested at something like a 3 or 5 year rotation. So that's not suitable for a stove necessarily. Personally, alder coppices very well, or pollards very well. So coppice where you cut it out of the ground and you get lots of stems coming up. And so you can have lots of stems to manage there, or pollard where you can cut it off or cut off stems or branches at a higher level, and it then generates lots of growth higher up. That's quite convenient for firewood, and that's what I do personally as well. I do lots of pollarding, so I take the top off the deciduous trees, and almost all of them, alder, rowan, birch, oak, aspen, they're all absolutely fine. They all sprout again. And then maybe after 5, 7, sometimes 10 years, you then got kind of 4-inch growth en masse, maybe sort of 10 or 15 branches coming out. That depends. I just use hand tools for that because they don't need to fell anything bigger. So I just work with logs. I never need to split any logs because I just cut my own stuff from that height. So alder, very good. Aspen, any of the poplars are very good for that. And things like sycamore and oak and ash, they can be a bit slower growing, but they can be good for that as well. But the native willows as well, grey and goat willow work particularly well for that. I love the smell of grey and goat willow on the fire as well. It's quite a good tree and very fast growing. And you can do no wrong with willows as well. You can just cut them right down and they'll just come straight back up again.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, last couple of questions. Is there any seedlings that you have found that deer, rabbits, voles and mice wouldn't eat?
All are kind of fairly palatable. I've found in the ground, oak hasn't had so much of a problem for me personally, hasn't been nobbled. Rowan has had a real issue with voles having it off, having the top off, and it's a devil. They tend to just nip the tops all the time. They don't seem to eat it down or strip it or girdle it too much. They just tend to nip the tops, and I think it's just the buds as they come. So that's a bit of a problem. Now I think if you've got high density of deer, it can be a real challenge. It can be very difficult. Things like willows, they're very good at having the tops nipped, and they'll just keep growing. They'll keep growing, and they'll have more of a low growing form. But lots of them will once they get nipped, that's them done. Particularly like conifers, they've been at one stem really, and if they get that nipped, that's pretty difficult. Scots pine doesn't get nibbled so much. All these kind of resinous ones, I say oak, they're very high in tannins. You often find them coming going orangey red when they're first coming out, and willows are very good for that as well. They load it with tannins, and so it makes it unpalatable for a time. But deer can be a real problem at all stages because they can often girdle and strip the tree as well. They can use their teeth to strip the bark, and they can thrash the tree as well, and just snap it. We have a deer fence on our croft here, so it is a real challenge. And so you'll be looking at tree guards for most things really, and deer control. I wish I could give you a quick solution for it. And there's nothing you can pour on the tree. There's nothing you can put around it. You can try and protect them with like large piles of brush. Basically, you need to get the deer managed, and I know that's a big issue for a lot of folk up here in the Highlands trying to grow things. It can be a real challenge.
Yep. Okay. Now, how many years would you give a tray of seeds before you give up on it if there's no growth?
If there's no growth, it depends what it is, of course. I mean, if it's something like hawthorns and rose, then you can keep kind of picking them out. Even elders, they can come 3, 4, 5 years later from the same trays. And that's the difficulty of using the same compost and mixing it all up again, because you just get all sorts of fun things. By now, I recognise all my seedlings now, so I know what they look like when they're 5 mils high. So that's helpful. So I know it's something that's desirable. And you can tell a woody stem from a weedy stem quite quickly. You get your eye into that. Probably 3 years. I would think in most cases would be about right. If it's in deeper soil, you've probably got more chance. If it's in a seed tray, if it hasn't come up at that point, I think it's probably done.
Okay, someone was suggesting as a alternative to deer control or pest management, grow gorse first, then grow the hedge amongst the gorse to protect the saplings.
Yeah, well, they say thorn is the mother of the oak, and that's how a lot of those species can develop. And if you see a bank of gorse, that's a very, very, very true statement. Of course, you get all the birds that roost in there. The first things that usually come through will be things like the rowans, and the deer and other things. The rabbits just don't get them, and so they then grow through, and then eventually, of course, oaks and other things spreading as they get mature. So yes, that kind of natural system. And I've read somewhere in New Zealand, gorse is a problem in New Zealand, but they're actually using it as protection for the native forests. So they allow the gorse to survive in certain areas, and then allow the native trees to get through, away from a lot of the browsing species. And then they remove the gorse after that once the trees are established. So it is, very good tip. But a lot of people don't like gorse, but it fixes the soil. It's a great plant for wildlife. I'm very pro gorse.
Yes, JB that commented that, saying it's also nitrogen fixing, so good for the soil.
Yes, That's probably Jill, I suspect. Hi.
And it flavours gin as well.
Oh, I've not done that. I've not tried that myself. There's so many things could flavour spirits.
Yeah.
Find out more.
So the last question that we have, oh no, there is a few more questions popping up now.
Yeah.
So we'll just carry on for a wee while longer. There was a question about feeding the seedlings.
Yeah.
Couple of questions. Do you add slow release fertilizer to the growing medium, or what do you use to feed the seedlings with in pots?
So in commercial operations and in like forestry operations, they will often use these little pellets. You can get them in a supermarket. You can get them in centres. They are slow release pellets. They've got kind of a seed coat on them. Really, they're like little yellowy seeds often. And you can put a scattering of those in with the compost, and then over the year they tend to break down, and then they're accessible to the tree, and that helps. That's like £4 for a big pot, and that would do a huge number of trees to do that. I think you can definitely overfeed. You can kind of get bolting with that, but that is a good solution, and that's what they use commercially. If you're kind of feeding your veg anyway with kind of compost teas and whatever you've made, or just you can make comfrey teas and nettle teas. We covered this on some of the other weeks on growing your own veg and things. We recommend those kind of things rather than bought in fertilizers, of kind of rather dubious kind of backgrounds. A lot of those fertilizers, of course, how they're made. But I say you're trying to get a tree away, then you do want it to be fed. I have used those pellets, and they do work definitely. But then after that, I tend to just switch to homemade stuff, and it does definitely work. Just any kind of feed. You'll read there's different types of compost, different types of fertilizer. You can ones that are particularly for trees or shrubs. Often maybe a bit heavier on kind of the potash and things, but you can recreate it. So if you've got a wood stove yourself or things, then you can get some of those elements in yourself. You can make your own little mixes for that yourself. So I wouldn't go spending too much money on it, but those pellets that were suggested there, kind of NPK pellets or OEK, they might say listed as OEK, they're quite a good way of doing it. And I saw some in the supermarket the other day, just in little pellets, so that is quite good. Used sparingly in with the compost. Yeah, good tip.
Thank you. Someone was asking, just coming back to the gorse, would the trees eventually shade out the gorse so it wouldn't have to be removed? We've got quite a lot of gorse beside our house, and I think it would take quite a lot for it to be shaded out.
Yeah, it's just kind of natural succession. It just kind of it gets old and leggy. Gorse just tends to either just die out, open up and die out a fair bit, and then it'll become less favourable. Yes, the trees will eventually shade out, but a long time down the line. On the whole, it just starts to die back and opens right. It kind of splits. The gorse is typically a fire-dominated species as well. Once it gets older, it's ripe to burn, and it will burn very quickly, which is a danger for young trees and things. And there's lots of banks of gorse, particularly in Lochalsh. I'm just thinking just behind our learning centre in Untitled, there's a huge bank of it there. But through that, there's elder and hawthorn and rose and all of those species probably wouldn't necessarily have been there because there's quite a lot of roe deer down in that spot there if it wasn't for the gorse. So yeah, just leave it be. I wouldn't recommend cutting gorse. That's a labour-intensive task and very prickly, very difficult. The trees will be doing just fine. They'll be benefiting from the gorse for a long period of time.
And then the last question, just about your oak trees there. Would you prune the oak to one leader?
That is two species, two plants, two acorns that have done that. So I could prune that back and just have the one there. I'm not in a rush with all the trees on the croft here. I've got so many trees, I'm just planting more and more. So that's obviously for not a commercial situation. For me, I'm just going to plant that as it is and let them grow slowly. I know I'm going to look after those trees. If one dies, it doesn't matter. To be honest, with my own trees, if two die, it doesn't matter. I've got so many replacement things. It's kind of part of the natural order of things. If you're wanting that one to really survive, you should have pricked it out and thinned it out a lot earlier. It's very slow growing. I've had 2 years to do something with it. I'm going to plant those out there. I wouldn't divide those. I certainly wouldn't rip them apart because they're from a pot there. They'd be intertwined and causing quite a lot of damage. So,
if it was a single tree in a pot on its own, but it had multiple stems.
Oh right, sorry. Yes, yeah.
They clarified there while you were talking.
Yes, no, yeah. I went off on the tangent there. Well, if it's gone into multiple stems quite early on, it's likely because it's been nipped or grazed or damaged, because they tend to go for a single leader. So it's likely to be the form of the tree. So you can try and prune it into shape. That would more likely be kind of a summer pruning job, I think, if you're trying to do that. But I think on the whole, if it's into multiple stems early on, something's had it, a rabbit or a vole, it'll still be okay. And one of those will come out as a leader and eventually get it, and it'll be a bit of a funny shape. But who likes plain old straight trees anyway?
More fun for climbing.
Yes, exactly. In about 80 years' time.
Yeah, I was going to say for the grandchildren. So Andy, who asked that question, was saying that his oaks often have multiple stems and they're not grazed. So.
Okay. I mean, certainly a lot of the gnarly oaks we have here on the west coast of Scotland, they're very twisted and gnarly, and you can see that they quickly get like that. I suppose it depends how you've grown it as well. So if you've grown it in quite a competitive environment where it's kind of encouraging it to go up, a lot of trees are then put into tree guards these days as well, and kind of ghastly, great big plastic tubes, but that encourages them to kind of go straight up as well and get a long form on it.
Okay, now
it depends where they come from as well. Like down south, the oaks almost certainly will be going tall and straight. Up here, they're darn sight gnarly, aren't they? They like the heights that they get down south.
So the last question, which I think is a very nice question to end on. Are there any native species that are in decline or struggling that you would be recommending that we all try and grow?
Yeah, so aspen, number one, absolutely aspen, get that in. Depends if you're growing that in a garden, that's quite a fast growing species. Aspen needs a lot of attention. In terms of our other rarer plants, a lot of them, I've been thinking kind of on the whole, most of our rarer plants are willows or rare kind of white beams, and they're growing often in fairly extreme environments. A lot of the rarer willows, if you do want to grow some trees and kind of help things along, there's lots of like different willows that are being propagated en masse. A project in Cairngorms right now, Cairngorms Connect, they've got a tree nursery which is looking at a lot of the willows. Dundregan Tree Nursery for Trees for Life, they look at some of the rarer willows from the mountains, but they will propagate and spread down at sea level as well. It'll be absolutely fine. But they do a lot of good work with those rarer trees there. But if you're going to plant aspen, particularly things like ash that's dying off now, could be as a disaster for ash. Maybe it's not going to be as bad, we don't know. But you're looking for a species that does a similar job to ash, then for me, aspen is good for that because it comes into leaf late, similar form, and it allows the same kind of plants to grow underneath it because of the timings and nutrients. So, yeah, let's just go with aspen.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Phil. That's all the questions. There's lots of people saying thank you very much, that they've really enjoyed it and have been inspired to get growing as well. So that's really good. And yeah, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us. We can all go and get our dinner now.
It's 6 o'clock now. We've fairly gone on. We're 5:30 last time, 6 o'clock today, but I'm glad there's been
yeah. Oh, well, everyone's enjoying it, so. You're the expert on these things, so it's good to pick your brains while we have you.
Well, I'm happy to take questions and be contacted on these things as well. I do post on social media for all the tree growing stuff. I'm not on any kind of commercial angle on it. I just do it for the love of it.
And on Facebook, you're Wildlife
Croft Skye. For Facebook and Instagram, Wildlife Croft Skye. We kind of, you don't see my name kind of hidden in the front there. It's kind of hidden a bit behind. But yeah, Wildlife Croft Skye. You'll find a lot of that information. And
what I can do is I can share that on the Facebook event and see about once I get the clips up onto YouTube. I do plan on emailing all the participants that have joined to say that they are available, so it will be available. It might take a wee while. One of my children will be going back to school next week, so I should hopefully have a wee bit more time.
You're doing a grand job, Karen.
But no, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Good night.